Hey everyone, today is the 9th of May, and this is the Drake Martinez podcast. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Today we're going to be talking about the death of American education. And I think nothing really shows how far off we are in education here in the United States more than what's going on today in the campuses around America that have all of these pro-Palestinian protests. And yeah, so let's dive into that today. It's a heavy topic. It's not a fun one, but it's one that is very necessary in covering and discussing because there's a lot more to this issue than just what's happening on the campuses. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of American education, why it's so bad, and then we're going to move into the ways in which in the last 30, 40 years, American education has just taken a complete nosedive, particularly, but not just, but not solely focused on what's happening in the American universities, the student debt issue, and then going on to what's happening in the campuses today and why this Palestinian movement, this pro-Palestinian movement, is so epitomizes the death of American education. Okay, so let's get on with it. Today, I sit here as an American citizen. I grew up here. I was born here. I was born in the United States. I grew up on the East Coast in a lovely city called Boston, Massachusetts. It is one of the most well-educated, most advanced in terms of, education in the country. It's even today, it's marveled and celebrated as not just like the birthplace of so many of the American ideas that created America, the conception of it, the conception of the American Revolution, the outbreak of the American Revolution. It is a very, very important city in terms of like America's history. Probably one of the most. If you had to name two American cities that were instrumental in creating America's future, Boston and New York City would be the top two for sure. In any event, I grew up during a time in which education was taken very seriously in the schools that I went to, but even there, in the what is considered like the creme de la creme in terms of like American education in the United States. I mean, there's so many different colleges that are in Boston, Massachusetts. You got Boston College, you got MIT. Well, it's in Cambridge, but very close. Literally the next city over. You got Harvard and Boston University, Boston College, Northeastern University, and many, many more. There's so many different great schools in Boston, Massachusetts alone, and in neighboring Cambridge. And I'm not sure if I mentioned MIT, but MIT's there as well. There's so many of them, and so many different people come to Boston for education from all around the United States. That just a little fun fact that so many people love. That's the reason why so many people love the Boston Red Sox all around the world, is because when they even around the world, but especially here in the United States, because they went to school in Boston. They grew up in New York. They grew up in Iowa, Ohio, California, wherever. And then they went to Boston for school, and, they got drunk at Red Sox games and hung out in Fenway. And, this all happened like, 3 miles away from where I grew up in Boston. And so many people go back to where they're from and just love the Red Sox, love Boston sports because they have such fond memories of their college years learning and experiencing the city. They might have come from small towns and like lived in a big city for the first time, and then that propelled them to a new newer and greater things in their career and in their lives. So I grew up right around there, and I had a lot of teachers growing up, and I can tell you that until I turned, I want to say like 17, 16, which was like around the time of the beginning of the Iraq War, probably like 2003. 2003, I was like 16. So from the time that I was like 4 years old until the time I was 16, I couldn't tell you what my teachers' politics were. I didn't know. They didn't make it known to us. They didn't make it evident if they were Republicans or Democrats or Independents or Green Party or whatever, Libertarian. They didn't make any political comments. They didn't make any jibes at the president, Congress. They would teach you about civics. They would teach you about how like government was set up. If you were paying attention, you could learn. You know, that was kind of like the schools that I went to. Like, there was a lot of distractions. There was a lot of kids that weren't doing like what they needed to do in order to be able to learn. A lot of them weren't ready, you know, for whatever reason, you know, but if you could pay attention, if you could sit through the class and deal with those distractions, you could learn something in those classrooms that I attended in Boston Public Schools. And in any event, once I got to about 16 and the Iraq War started, that was when I started learning about my teachers' political preferences, that most, if not all of them, were Democrats. That's not really surprising in a city like Boston, but I grew up in a family that was very anti-communist, very Christian family. And, you know, we didn't really discuss politics at home. That wasn't something that I knew a lot about. I knew about the civics. I knew about the government and how government functioned, but I didn't really know a lot about politics. I couldn't tell you too much about what was happening in the country in terms of like government, in terms of like what was happening in, you know, Congress, what the new legislation was. I just kind of knew like from pop culture or from commonly known things, but my teachers never ever made it apparent or known how they felt about political leanings. And that was because, and it's not like they never came up. Of course they would come up, but my teachers back then had a very strict acknowledgement. And this was sort of, I thought at least, the status quo, that most teachers operated this way, at least back then, that revealing your political leanings as a teacher is akin to like brainwashing your students, because you have, as a teacher, such level of authority that over them, and they revere you as their teacher, or at least most of them do, but you all understand what I'm talking about, that they are your teacher. They are the ones that are giving you information. They are the ones that are teaching you new ways of thinking, new material, new subjects, you know, giving you access to new methods of evaluation and methods. And for them to give you a perspective of their own political leanings is akin again to brainwashing, because through that position of authority that they have, that it's so compelling, and children are so, you know, easily influenced. They're so impressionable, especially by their teachers, that, you know, that it's an abuse. It was viewed as an abuse of authority, is what I'm trying to get at. That's why none of my teachers ever did it. And I can say to a T, they never did it. Not a single one. The Iraq War changed that. And for the first time, I started hearing things like, oh, the president's an idiot. The president's stupid. I can't believe that we're doing this. The world's laughing at us. 2003 was the first time in public schools that I ever heard that type of language. Of course, that type of language is ubiquitous now. But I think that it's important to remember that it wasn't always like that. Especially after 9/11, there was always like a sense of unity for those short 2 years. But when 2003 came around, that was the end of that. And again, prior to that, maybe it was because Bill Clinton was in office during that time of my life. I can't really tell you, but you know what I can remember is criticism of the government, or revealing criticism of the government's fine, but again, revealing your political leanings as a teacher was not done. It was not done at all. So I go to college, and also in Boston. I didn't want to go, but my My family made me go. I wanted to join the military out of high school, but I had a lot of things going on at home that my mother wanted me to take care of the family, and by doing so, I needed to stay. I needed to stay in the city, so I got a very small scholarship to stay in Boston and to go to any one of the state-run schools, so like UMass Boston, any of the community colleges for tuition free. So I went to UMass Boston. I went there and studied there. And it was there that I started being exposed to communism for the first time, like actual legit communists and teachers that were openly advocating for communism. And like this was a shock to me because I grew up in a anti-communist family. My dad's side of the family, they all escaped from Cuba. They escaped the Castro regime, and they did so very early on. They came here, I think it was during the 50s that they came here actually. And it was like, so pretty close to like immediately after or like during the Castro Revolution in Cuba, that either they had lost or feared that they would lose their property due to the Castro Revolution, the Communist Revolution, and then they fled to the United States. My grandfather then served in the army, and they got, citizenship, etc., and then they became, Americans, just like as American as apple pie, Americana. They were really against speaking Spanish, that they embraced the new homeland. They embraced the country that took them in, and they viewed communism as an evil system of government that is highly oppressive and violates human rights, etc. And all those things are true, remain true, will always be true. So come to my surprise that in high school, or in college rather, that I had open communist professors. And I remember very vividly I had a class with Professor Esther Kingston Mann. And she had the audacity, I remember during one of our classes, to say something to the effect that, this is a Cold War class. And she said something to the effect that, John F. Kennedy never took responsibility for the Bay of Pigs invasion and what happened there. If you know your history, you'd actually learn that he really wasn't responsible, that he didn't have anything to do with it, and then condemned the CIA for it and said that he would scatter the CIA into like a million different pieces and throw them to the wind, something to that effect. But he also said that, victory has a thousand fathers, but defeat is an orphan. And he was directly taking responsibility for the invasion of Cuba and the Bay of Pigs invasion and the failure there. So even though his CIA went rogue on him, I think he might have had some responsibility because he greenlit it, but he said basically like, don't make it seem like we're involved, like no air superiority can come from the United States. And then when the military asked for it, or the military and the CIA asked for it, he said, no, we can't make it seem like this was sanctioned or that we're even involved. So I guess some level of involvement is accurate, but not to the extent that he really could have taken, the fall for something like that. But he did. So I said to her during that class, I said, hey, Miss Professor, what about the victory has a thousand fathers, but defeat is an orphan speech? And she was shocked that I knew that back then. Mind you, this is 2005, 2006, and smartphones weren't a thing yet. Like you had to remember things back then. You had to just know those things in your head and not be able to like Google things on the spot. In any event, so she was like shocked, and then she kind of like backpedaled a bit and started talking about like the glories of communism, and had another professor who did something very similar, but I don't really have as many vivid memories of his classroom as I did with hers, because his was on revolutions and hers was about communism, or more about the Cold War, but she advocated for communism in that class about the Cold War. So kind of my shock, like these are ideas that are being spouted at the university in 2005, 2006. And unless you had very good historical understanding, if you knew these like little bits of like of minute details about historical events, you could be really easily swayed one way or the other by your professors. And again, I don't know what attending university prior to the Iraq War was like. Maybe it had the same type of environment that I experienced in public school, that your teachers didn't reveal, or your professors rather, didn't reveal their political leanings. So I don't know if that was how the norm was also in on universities or in college campuses at the time, but in elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, the norm was that the teachers wouldn't try to influence you and have undue influence over your thinking, especially in the area of politics, because they viewed it more as not just as an abuse of power, but it defeated the whole purpose of trying to cultivate critically thinking minds that, saturating your students with your own political and your own personal beliefs about things, not just on the topic of politics, but of any kind of like opinion based area, was viewed as like, again, that misuse of power, the misuse of authority that the teacher has over their classroom. And so I experienced that in college for the first time. I experienced that in high school for the first time after the Iraq War. And I wonder if that was the norm, in universities prior to the Iraq War. I would imagine that was also probably the case during the Vietnam War. And you can see that explosive effect of protests and riots that were happening on college campuses in the United States during the Vietnam War. And that actually makes sense because the United States was involved in the Vietnam War, and people, something to the effect of, I think, 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam. And, so our tax dollars were directly going to the war, but also to the effect that, many people knew Americans that had died in Vietnam during that time, especially at that age, because of the draft. And so that protest makes sense. And then when you see what happens today, when this war doesn't really affect the United States, that the only Americans that are involved in what's happening in Israel, in Palestine, the conflict, is the Americans that were kidnapped and tortured and still remain kidnapped and held hostage by Hamas. So you would think that the protest would be, hey, let's bring those American citizens back, but they are anti-Israel protests, which, of course, everyone's entitled to their own beliefs, but it makes you wonder, or at least makes me wonder, why there's so much fervor in a war that the only Americans that are involved are the ones that are captured. And I think intrinsically we all understand that we only have so much energy, we only have so many resources, we only have so much time. And is this a good use of these students' time to destroy the college campuses, prevent other people from attending class, and cause these demonstrations that are a break or a halt to their own education for a war that they're not involved, that their country is not involved in, that their countrymen aren't fighting. And sure, some of our tax dollars go to Israel for, their military aid, but we also have a lot more going to Ukraine, and they're not protesting the war in Ukraine. They're not protesting what's happening in Ukraine. It all just seems very manufactured. It all seems very designed and sponsored by somebody. It seems like this is an agenda. This isn't organic. It's not, again, there's no question that the protests that occurred in the 60s and 70s on college campuses for the Vietnam War were organic. Again, Americans were dying there. American dollars were funding the war. People didn't like the war, or a lot of people rather didn't like the war, and they wanted the troops to come home. They wanted no involvement in it, and they didn't want it to be in their name. They didn't see a purpose behind it. All those things are totally understandable. You can disagree on the politics of, and like the history of that, but there are at least understandable positions that led to protests from students. Again, if they knew somebody that had died in the war and they're like, this war is stupid. Like, why are we doing this? My cousin died over there. I'm going to go protest. That's organic. That is a movement that, makes sense. Demonstrations that make sense. This one, it doesn't. I'm sorry, but it doesn't. I don't see how, unless they've been whipped up into this fervor that that would make them be compelled so much that they would spend their time and their energy towards these protests, unless they were either being paid or compensated or brainwashed in a way that made them feel either socially or financially compelled in order to have to do it. Which leads me to another thing that I experienced when I was at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, all those years ago, which was that I had actually seen a lot of pro-Palestinian protests during that time. I think 2005, 2006 was right around the time that there was a conflict between Israel and Hamas, and I think it was right around the time that Israel just gave up on Gaza and gave it to Hamas and was like, okay, well, you guys have full authority now. But there was a very, very small group of students who either were Palestinian or were like Lebanese or something like that. And they had like a personal vested interest in what was happening there. So they demonstrated. And I remember thinking like, what the heck is even like Palestine? Like, I don't even know what this place is. I kind of heard about it, but I don't really know too much about it. And I don't know why these students are so upset about what's going on over there, And again, these were very, very small demonstrations, a very, very small group of students that really knew the situation over there, at least from their point of view, inside and out. So they would talk about it, and then other students would get involved or be like, or at least listen. And most of them would just be like, I don't have the time for this, and I don't really care about it. Sorry, but I got other things I got to do. I have classes I have to attend, and I'm paying for these classes, so I'm not going to waste my time with this when I got to go do, biology 2, or I've got a Calc 3 class coming up. So this leads me to think that what's going on the American campuses, not only is there a great deal of brainwashing and a great deal of professors influencing their students in order to think as they do, but there seem to sort of be like gearing them up in a very particular set of beliefs and a very like structured system of thinking. And of course, we know now that there's just like so many different avenues of thinking that were incorrect, that led to so many different atrocities actually that occur from like what they call like the ivory tower. These professors from MIT, from Harvard, that got involved in different government projects back in like the 60s, such as MK Ultra, and they were just like actively seeking, not just passively or by coincidence, but actively seeking to brainwash students and conduct experiments on them that led to things like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. And, if you ever read the CIA secret history in the 60s, this whole movement of what was happening with MK Ultra and acid during the 60s and the 70s, and how the CIA and different psychiatrists that were involved were, using these drugs and experiments to influence students to experiment on mind control. So these are all things that we know about that it did occur, and it makes me wonder about like what's happening in the colleges and on these campuses today. Like how much more aggressive is it? Obviously they're not using drugs, or maybe they are, but the methods seem to be so perfected that they could get a whole generation of students, again, who their families aren't fighting in the war. They don't even see the war. And it gets to the point where they not only are people demonstrating and ruining their education on this, but there was a guy that put himself on fire emulated himself, like, what was it, like a month ago, 2 months ago, over a war that, again, his friends aren't fighting in. His family's not fighting in. The only Americans involved are the ones that are held hostage by the ones that he's protesting for. So it makes me wonder, like, with all it, so people have a tendency to act out of their self-interest. And if people don't act out of self-interest, then something else is going on. And this is a case of like something else is going on. You know, again, the last time that these huge demonstrations popped up to this degree was not even the Iraq War. I went to school during the Iraq War in colleges. There weren't demonstrations on this scale. The last ones that were this immense was Vietnam. And again, Vietnam makes sense. 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam. You know, these people's, you know, back then their cousins, their brothers, their sisters, etc. You know, they died there. So it makes sense that they would have that personal vested interest. So this comes up to what can we do, or like what is the future of education? So the system of education has just been so broken that, you know, the student loan, and then I think the student loan issue is like, and is another thing that speaks to how broken the American education system is. That I feel like so many, if you had a good deal, right? Like if I went to a restaurant and I got a really great meal, I'd be happy to pay for it. I'd be like, yeah, you know what? These guys provided excellent service. I got an awesome steak. My wife really loved her steak. You know, we had a great meal. It was a great atmosphere. They really took care of us. You know, we wanted that experience of going out and having a nice dinner and unwinding and like not having to cook in the house. And these people really went the extra way to take care of us. I'd be happy to pay for that meal, right? Obviously, millions and millions of Americans don't feel that way about their education. It didn't make them wealthy. It didn't make millions of Americans like even have the opportunity to like pay that back by getting a substantial increase in their earning potential and their income, which is what, you know, a lot of people, you know, sell the university education system on, is like, yeah, it'll be a return on your investment. You will spend X amount of money, but you will make it back by the job that you're going to be able to secure once you come out of the education system. Okay, you know, seems like a fair deal. I go there, I pay them that X amount of money. 4 years later, I increase my earning potential, and I can get a job somewhere else. I can pay back the money very quickly. Well, millions of Americans found out that those jobs didn't exist. And it reminds me of a historical situation that happened in the Soviet Union. I think it was in the early 70s. So if you look at a lot of like the Soviet immigrants that came to the United States, and you'll even see this today, like if you talk to a lot of them that came here during the 70s and the 80s and the 60s, that a lot of the Soviet immigrants that came to the United States were overeducated. Because education was free, because it was so abundant, that, you know, all you needed to do was just like, hey, I'm going to go to school and become a, biochemist, right? The Soviets actually created a whole town that this town was designed to produce nuclear physicists. And to the letter, every single child that grew up in that town got a education that put them on track to become nuclear physicists. And they all completed the education program. You know, people of varying levels of intelligence all completed it and were able to work as nuclear physicists. The only problem was that once they got out of school, there weren't enough positions to be filled as nuclear physicists. And the reason why the Soviet Union did that was because they needed more nuclear physicists in order to be able to compete with the United States. But they didn't take into account like what the market actually needs, how many positions are actually required for the jobs that are available to do that job. So what do? You have a whole class of people who are overeducated for positions that they don't need that education to do that job. And if that sounds familiar, that's pretty much what happened here in the United States, from 2006 onward, that you have a whole class of, overeducated people that, got bachelor's and master's degrees only to become waiters and Uber drivers and Lyft drivers. And of course that would make a lot of people upset, right? So what does the American education system have to do to change? Because there's a lot of people that aren't just fed up with the university system. There's a lot of people that are fed up with the public school system. That, new parents, I talk to so many new parents and people from all around the country and all around California that are like, I'm not sending my kids to that school. Like, I'd rather homeschool my kid. I'd rather make sure that they're not getting pumped with propaganda, that they're not getting brainwashed, and that they're not getting, they're not going to come back thinking that, my son's a girl or my girl's a boy or any of the other crazy things that they're teaching in the school. And what's awful about it is it's very like Trojan horse, that there's so many great teachers and there's so many great education programs that it only really takes a couple of them, or just policies that come from the school boards, that can derail and, again, that abuse of authority. A teacher has an authority figure in the classroom, and using their own personal beliefs to influence the students who are very highly impressionable, especially of authority figures, is an abuse of that position. And it really only takes maybe one or two of those types of people in that school system to influence your child one way or the other. And that's particularly egregious when the policies are designed in order for them to be able to do that with impunity. So I think what we're going to start seeing when we go as these situations progress is competence is going to be more valued than ever. People with real world experience, people with military experience, people with, that went to, did internships, that actually know how to do the job, that can actually work with people, that weren't brainwashed by, the university system, that don't have all these crazy ideas and can actually just show up to work, do the job, do it effectively and efficiently, and have a certain degree of competence and effectiveness. Those are the people that are going to be who's hired, and I think we're going to start seeing a lot of disappearance of these majors that, that don't produce an accredited system of knowledge. For example, like, of course, you're going to need a degree for things like mechanical engineering or, structural engineering, chemical engineering, all those types of things. But for other jobs that are more like OJT type of things, then I think we're gonna start seeing more and more of people turning away from just checking the boxes and more towards analyzing the individual and their actual experiences. But who knows what that's going to actually look like with, it seems like a whole generation of kids that are going to be growing up homeschooled, not just because of what happened with COVID, but because of the transgender policies, LGBT policies, and just the general lack of safety in public schools, and parents being threatened with, even all the way up to the FBI with surveillance for just caring about what kind of education that their children are getting. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot of those types of changes coming in the future, and hopefully that will have an effect on the American education system and in the American industries that will see more practical education, teaching children how to manage their finances, teaching children how taxes work, teaching children not politics but civics. How does our system of government work? How does it differ from governments of the past? Why does the American system of government view power the way that it does, with such fears, with such fear of power, and how the conglomeration of power is such a dangerous thing for liberty and for prosperity? A practical economic understanding of how economies work. How do markets work? How did markets work in the past? How did products that people didn't think they even needed became things that they couldn't do without? Entrepreneurship, running a business, how to start a business, how to understand the legal system to a degree that children can run a business on their own, even a small operation, and learn through experience and utilizing their creativity and artistic vision to create the future that we're going to need them to create. So there's a lot of new and exciting things that can happen in education, but how much of it is being stymied and how much of it is being warped by the modern American education system? How much of it is being twisted and contorted into something that, is just reminiscent again of that Soviet style of this town is going to produce 30 nuclear physicists. I don't care what those children and their dreams are, and like what their natural abilities are and what they hope for themselves. They're all going to be nuclear physicists, only to come out of many, many years of study and not being able to get a job as a nuclear physicist. Okay, well, with that, I'll leave you guys for next time, and we'll hope you guys have a great weekend and a great Mother's Day. See you guys next time.